the throne room of the Vhasgarn Ascendancy, did not receive petitioners so much as it swallowed them. It was a chamber grown, not built, its walls of living coral metal humming faintly with the resonance of 10,000 years of conquest, and at its center, upon a dais that floated a full meter above the polished floor, sat Emperor Ossruth Vaan, ninth of his line, master of 1,100 subject worlds, and the being who would one day be remembered across the whole spiral arm as the fool who laughed at Earth. On that particular cycle, however, he was merely bored. "Read it again," he said, and his voice was the low grinding of stone against stone, the sound his species made when they wished to convey that they were paying attention as a favor rather than a duty. "The part about the deadline, I want to savor it." The herald, a slender Kithra with translucent skin through which one could see the nervous flicker of 3 hearts, bowed low and unrolled the data scroll once more. "The Terran conquered acknowledges receipt of the Ascendancy's ultimatum," she read, and her voice trembled only slightly. "They further acknowledge the demand for the surrender of their forward system, Kesh Corridor, and its 90 million inhabitants, along with the tithe of 1/3 of all Terran industrial output, in perpetuity, as reparation for what the Ascendancy terms the crime of expansion into claimed space. And their answer," Ossruth leaned forward, the chitinous plates of his face catching the amber light. "The delicious part. Their answer, Radiance, is a single word. They say no." The court laughed. It was a well-trained laugh, the kind that rose and fell on cue, and it filled the grown chamber like water filling a wound. Ossruth allowed himself the deep vibration in his thorax that passed among his people for amusement, and he settled back into the cradle of his throne, and he considered the little blue world that had dared to send him such a message. He had ruled for 230 of their years. He had broken the silicon hives, whose ships could turn a sun's light into a lance. He had ground the proud Ottavan Republic into a client state that now sent him poets as tribute. He had watched species older and stronger than these humans bend the knee, and he had never once needed to visit a world personally to break it. Fear did his walking for him. Fear was patient and it was free. "Show me them," he said. "The humans, not the diplomats, the rabble. I want to see what I am so gravely afraid of." The chamber's air thickened and resolved into an image drawn from 100 intercepted broadcasts and 1,000 captured signals. Ossruth watched. He saw a species of soft, endoskeletal bipeds, hairless save for absurd patches, who covered their vulnerabilities in woven fiber and who lived, most of them, no longer than a single Vhasgarn adolescence. He saw them crowd into vast cities of poured stone. He saw them dance and weep and shout at each other across tables. He saw them play games with balls and with words and with numbers, and he saw them, over and over in image after image, doing a thing his own people had no true word for. He saw them lose and get up, and try again at things that did not matter, for reasons that made no sense. "They are children," Ossruth pronounced. "A young species, barely 3,000 years of recorded history. They have never fought a war across the dark. They have never lost a world. They do not know what it is to be truly beaten, and so they mistake their ignorance for courage." He waved a heavy hand and the image dissolved. "Send them the second ultimatum. Have the deadline. When they miss it, we will take Kesh Corridor as a demonstration, and I will hear that word no turn into a very different sound. Something wetter." The court laughed again on cue. And 900 light-years away, in a lecture hall built into the flank of a mountain that had once been a mine, a young woman named Corin Vale was arguing with her professor about the very same thing. The Kesh Corridor Institute of Applied Defense was not, whatever its grand name suggested, a grand place. It was a working academy, carved out of the Braddock Massif on the coreward edge of the Kesh system, and it existed for one reason: to turn the sons and daughters of miners and freight pilots and hydroponic farmers into the people who would hold the line when the line, inevitably, came under pressure. Its corridors smelled of ozone and machine oil, and the particular ozone sweetness of overworked cooling systems. Its cadets were young, most of them barely out of their teens, and they were, to a person, aware that they lived on the exact spot on the map that a very large empire had just announced it intended to take. Corin Vale was 19 years old. She had a pilot's reflexes and an engineer's hands and a temper. She was still, at 19, learning to steer rather than to swallow. She had grown up on Kesh Station 3, watching her mother repair the mag couplings on ore haulers that were older than the colony itself, and she had learned early that a machine did not care how you felt about it. It only cared whether you understood it. That lesson had made her a very good pilot and a very difficult student. "With respect, Professor Nadine," she said, standing in a hall gone suddenly quiet, "you're teaching us to lose." Professor Ilian Nadine was a tired man with gray at his temples and the flat, careful voice of someone who had spent 30 years explaining hard truths to the young. He did not rise to the challenge. He rarely did. "I'm teaching you to survive, Cadet Vale. There is a difference, and you'll learn it or you'll die learning it. You showed us the projections." Corin gestured at the display still hanging in the air behind him, a cold lattice of numbers that mapped the Haskarn fleet against the Kesh defenses the way an avalanche maps against a snowman. 90 to 1 on hulls, 140 to 1 on firepower. Their smallest cruiser could burn this station off the rock without slowing down. And your lesson, your whole lesson, is how to conduct an orderly evacuation, how to run. Yes. 90 million people can't run, Professor. There aren't enough ships in the sector to move a fraction of them. You know that, so the lesson isn't how to evacuate. The lesson is how to decide who dies. And I don't want that lesson. I want the other one. There is no other one. Nadine said it gently, which was worse than if he'd said it with contempt. Corin, I have buried this argument in 100 cadets over the years. Every one of them was as bright as you and as angry as you, and just as certain that the universe would make an exception for how much they wanted it to. It doesn't. The Haskarn are old. They have done this 1,100 times. There is no clever trick, no plucky maneuver, no speech that changes the arithmetic. When a force that large decides to take a place this small, the only variable left to us is how many of our people we can carry away in the dark before the fire arrives. That is not cowardice. It is the last mercy of the competent. Sit down. She did not sit down. She stood there in the humming hall, in her cadet grays with the mountain and star of Kesh on the shoulder, and she felt something turn over in her chest. Something that had been turning over for the whole 3 weeks since the first ultimatum arrived. It was not quite courage, and it was not quite fear. It was closer to the feeling she got in a bad approach, when a haul was coming in too fast and too heavy, and the numbers said abort and her hands said no. Not yet, not yet. There's still one more thing to try. It was the refusal that lived below thought. You keep saying the arithmetic, she said quietly. But arithmetic changes when you change what's in the equation. You're solving for how do 90 million people run from a fleet. That's the wrong problem. It has no good answer, so you keep getting a bad one. The right problem is, what does it cost the ascendancy to take Kesh, and can we make that cost more than Kesh is worth? She looked at the cold lattice of numbers. Nobody in this room has solved that problem. Because everybody in this room already decided we've lost. The hall was very quiet. Nadine looked at her for a long moment. Something crossed his face that she would only understand much later, when she was older and had buried arguments of her own. It was not anger. It was grief, the specific grief of a man who has seen the thing he is looking at end badly, many times, and cannot make it end otherwise. "And how," he said, "do you propose to make 90 million people, most of them farmers and welders and children, worth more dead than alive to an empire that measures worlds in the millions?" "I don't know yet," Corin said. "No. But I know that I don't know yet and it's impossible are different sentences, and you've spent 3 weeks pretending they're the same one. She finally sat down because her legs had started to shake, and she would rather be thought done than be seen trembling. "That's all, Professor. I'm sorry for the interruption." She was not sorry. He knew she was not sorry. And that night, when the lecture hall had emptied and the mountain had gone quiet around him, Ilian Nadine sat alone in front of the cold lattice of numbers for a very long time, and then he did something he had not done in 11 years of burying this argument. He opened a channel to an old friend in the Concord Strategic Directorate, a woman he had trained beside when they were both as young and stupid and certain as Corin Vale, and he said, "Sabine, I think we've been solving the wrong problem. The thing about being underestimated is that it is, for a while, extremely useful." Emperor Ossruth have the deadline as he had promised, and the Terran Conquered did not answer, which pleased him, because silence from the weak was how fear announced itself. He ordered the assembly of the 9th Conquest Fleet at the staging yards of VHASC Prime, a leisurely process, because there was no hurry. The humans were not going anywhere. Their little corridor sat exactly where it had always sat, and would sit there still when the fleet arrived to fold it into the ascendancy like a card into a deck. What Ossruth did not know, because it did not occur to him to wonder, was what the humans were doing with the time his contempt had given them. He assumed they were doing what all cornered species did, negotiating with each other, jockeying for the lifeboats, some fraction of them preparing to flee and the rest preparing to bargain. He had watched it 1,000 times. The strong bent the knee slowly and the weak bent it fast, and either way the knee bent. He did not imagine, because his mind had no shape into which the thought could fit, that a species that lost at games for fun, that got up over and over from failures that did not matter, might have quietly become the single most stubborn thing in the spiral arm precisely, because it had never once been allowed to believe that losing was the end of anything. He did not imagine Corin Vale. He did not imagine 10,000 rooms across 100 human worlds, each one holding some angry, sleepless young person who had looked at the cold arithmetic and refused, on principle, to accept the answer it gave. He did not imagine that the Terran Conquered's greatest weapon was not a ship or a gun, but a cultural allergy to the word, inevitable, bred into them across 3,000 years of clawing up from mud on a world that had tried, again and again, to kill them, and had failed every time. He would learn to imagine all of it. It would take him rather less time than he expected, and it would cost him rather more than he could afford. But that was still to come. For now, on VHASC Prime, the Emperor watched his fleet assemble and felt the deep, patient satisfaction of a being who had never in his long life been wrong about anything that mattered. And in the mountain, Corin Vale stopped going to lectures. She did not stop going to lectures out of despair. She stopped because Professor Nadine came to find her, 3 days after the argument, in the maintenance bay where she was supposed to be studying, and was instead disassembling a decommissioned point defense turret to understand why the VHASCarn had never bothered to jam this particular model. "Walk with me," he said. They walked the long spinal corridor of the Braddock Massif, past the hydroponic galleries and the reactor housing and the vast dark windows that looked out at the Kesh sky, where the system's twin suns hung small and white and the ore freighters crawled between them like patient beetles. Nadine did not speak for a long time. When he did, his voice had changed. The tiredness was still there, but under it there was something Corin had not heard from him before, something that sounded almost like fear and almost like hope and was, she would later decide, simply honesty. "I sent your problem up the chain," he said. "You're reframing. What does it cost them to take Kesh, and can we make it cost more than Kesh is worth? I sent it to a friend in Strategic Directorate. I expected her to tell me what I've been telling you, that it's the fantasy of a bright child who hasn't seen enough death yet." He stopped and looked out the window. She didn't. She said the Directorate has been running that exact equation for 2 weeks. And that the answer is not impossible. The answer is catastrophically expensive and possibly worth it, and we do not have enough people who can do the work in the time we have." Corin said nothing. Her heart had begun to do the too fast, too heavy thing. "Understand what I'm telling you," Nadine said. "This is not a rescue. There is no fleet coming to save Kesh. The Conquered cannot match the Ascendancy hull for hull and will not throw its whole strength into a corridor it may lose anyway. What the Directorate is asking, what your reframing made them ask out loud, is a different question. It is, if we cannot stop them from taking Kesh, can we make the taking of Kesh so ruinous, so slow, so publicly humiliating, that the 1100 worlds already under the Ascendancy's heel begin to do the arithmetic themselves? Can we turn one small corridor into a wound that will not close?" "A demonstration," Corin said, the Emperor's own word, though she did not know it. "They want a demonstration." "They want to break the story," Nadine said. "The Ascendancy does not rule by strength, it rules by inevitability. 1100 worlds obey because obedience seems like the only sane response to the sky. Fear does the ruling. And fear is a story, Corin. It is the story that resistance is pointless. If one small human corridor makes resistance look not pointless but merely expensive, that story cracks. And a story that has ruled for 10,000 years does not crack quietly." He turned from the window and looked at her, and she saw that he had decided something and that it cost him. "They're standing up a program," he said, quietly. "They're pulling every young pilot, every engineer, every tactician who can think sideways instead of straight, and they're teaching them a kind of war the Ascendancy has never had to fight because no one has ever made them fight it. It is not a war you win by being stronger. It is a war you win by being impossible, by costing them every single day in ships and time and certainty until the certainty is gone." He paused. "I recommended you for it. Against my own better judgment, which has kept a great many cadets alive by teaching them to run. I recommended you because you are the first cadet in 11 years who made me doubt that running was the only answer, and I have decided at my age that I would rather be wrong about hope than right about despair." Corin Vale, 19 years old, stood in the spinal corridor of a mountain that an empire had marked for erasure, and did not trust herself to speak. "You'll report to Directorate Cell 7 at dawn," Nadine said. "It's underground, it doesn't officially exist, and Corin—" He almost smiled, and it made him look younger and older at once. "The arithmetic hasn't changed. 90 to 1, 140 to 1. Every number I showed you is still true. Don't let anyone tell you the odds are good. The odds are appalling. We are simply going to make the Ascendancy pay a price it never imagined it could be charged. Some of us will not live to see whether it works. Possibly you, possibly me. Do you understand what I'm offering you?" "Yes," Corin said. "And you want it anyway?" "Yes." "Then God help the Vhasgarn," said Professor Ilian Nadine, "because I have just handed them the worst thing in the galaxy. A young human who won't be told no." Directorate Cell 7 occupied the deepest worked-out gallery of the old mine, a cathedral-sized void in the rock lit by strung work lamps and filled, when Corin arrived at dawn, with perhaps 200 people and the largest concentration of stolen, borrowed, and improvised hardware she had ever seen in one place. She was, she quickly realized, one of the oldest people there. That was the first thing that upended her. She had imagined a war room full of gray-haired strategists, and instead she found a room full of the young, pilots barely old enough to hold a license, engineering students still wearing the coveralls of the yards they'd been pulled from, a knot of teenage mathematicians arguing over a hanging display so fast that the argument sounded like a single continuous sound. There were older people, yes, a scattering of directorate officers moving through the chaos like adults through a schoolyard. But the work, the actual work, was being done by people who had not yet learned that it couldn't be. That, she would understand later, was the entire point. A woman found her within the hour, tall, silver-haired, with the flat, careful eyes of someone who had spent a career being right about terrible things. She introduced herself as Directorate Coordinator Sabine Ayayul, Nadine's old friend, and she did not waste time. Nadine says you reframed the problem, Ayayul said, walking Corin through the chaos without slowing. That's why you're here, and it's the only reason you're here, so let me tell you what we've done with your reframing and where it breaks, because that's the job. Your job is to find where it breaks and unbreak it. Everyone in this room has that job. We are not soldiers. We are a problem that has decided not to have a solution. Yes, Coordinator. The Ascendancy Fleet Doctrine, Ayayul said, has one flaw, and it is not a flaw in their ships, which are superb, or their guns, which are worse than superb. It is a flaw in their assumptions. They have won 1,100 times, and every one of those wins taught them the same lesson, that a conquered world, seeing the fleet arrive, calculates its odds and surrenders in stages. Their entire war machine is built to accept surrender efficiently. It is optimized for the moment the enemy gives up. They arrive, they demonstrate, they wait for the knee to bend, and then they occupy. Fast, clean, cheap, 1,100 times. And if the knee doesn't bend, Corin said slowly, then every efficiency becomes a vulnerability. Ayayul stopped at a display showing the projected V-Hasgarn approach, a great arrowhead of ships descending on the Kesh Corridor from the coreward jump points. They come in tight because they expect no serious resistance. They stage their occupation transports close behind the warships because they expect to be unloading colonists within days, not fighting for months. They bring their supply train forward and lean because their supply lines have never been seriously threatened, because no one they conquer is ever still fighting long enough to threaten them. Every piece of their fleet is built around the assumption that we will behave rationally, which to them means, give up. Their strength is their certainty. And certainty, she said, is a thing you can attack. Corin looked at the arrowhead of ships, 90 to 1, 140 to 1, and for the first time she did not see an avalanche. She saw a machine, and machines did not care how she felt about them. They only cared whether she understood them. Show me their supply doctrine, she said. The tankers, the ammunition tenders, the transports, everything that isn't a gun. Ayayul looked at her, and something moved behind the flat, careful eyes. You're going to say what I think you're going to say. I'm going to say that a fleet built to accept surrender fast has no plan for a war that lasts, Corin said. They didn't bring enough food. They didn't bring enough fuel for a siege. They brought exactly what you bring to a thing you expect to be over in a week, so we don't fight the guns. She reached up and touched the great arrowhead, and with a gesture peeled away the warships, leaving the soft, vulnerable train of tankers and tenders and transports naked behind them. We fight the weak, we make it a year, and we let a year do to them what no gun of ours ever could. The room around her had gone, without her noticing, quiet. The teenage mathematicians had stopped arguing. The pilots in their borrowed coveralls had drifted closer. And Sabine Ayayul, Directorate Coordinator, veteran of being right about terrible things, looked at a 19-year-old from a mining station and felt, for the first time in a long career, the specific vertigo of watching someone find the floor of a problem she had thought was bottomless. That's the shape of it, Ayayul said quietly. That is exactly the shape of it, and we've had it for a week, and it terrifies me because to make it real we need to do 100 impossible things in 90 days with children against the greatest fleet this arm has ever produced. She looked around the cathedral of rock and lamplight and stubborn young faces. Welcome to Cell 7, Cadet Vale. You are now the deputy for interdiction planning. Your whole job is one sentence: make the week into a year. 900 light-years away, the week was going very well for Emperor Ossruth Vaan. The 9th Conquest Fleet had assembled ahead of schedule, 400 capital ships and their attendant swarm, a force of such overwhelming mass that its commanders had privately begun referring to the coming campaign not as a war but as a processing. Ossruth reviewed the fleet from the observation spire of his flagship, the weight of 10,000 years, and felt the calm that came from certainty. His analysts had projected the fall of the Kesh Corridor at 11 standard days from first contact. His logistics officers, always cautious, had provisioned for 30, and the provisioning officers had complained about even that as extravagant. "They will not fight," Ossruth told his fleet master, a scarred old warrior named Thren who had broken worlds before Corin Vale's grandmother was born. "You disagree. I can see it in your carriage." "I disagree that they will not fight, Radiance," Thren said, because he was old enough and decorated enough to disagree with an emperor. "I agree that it will not matter. A thing may fight and still not resist. A prey beast fights the jaws. It changes nothing." He studied the fleet. "But I have broken worlds where the population was warned, where they had time. Time is the one gift we should never give an enemy, and this Emperor's contempt has given the humans 90 days of it. I would not have halved the deadline. I would have doubled it and struck at the moment before it expired, when their preparations were half-built and their nerve was highest and most brittle." Ossruth vibrated with amusement. "You are a fine old blade, Thren, and you see war everywhere because a blade sees only cutting. But there is no preparation 90 days can build that 400 capital ships cannot erase in 11. What will they do with your precious time? Dig holes. We will fill them. Build guns. We have more. Frighten themselves with speeches." He turned from the fleet. "Time is only a gift to an enemy who can use it. And these are children who have never lost. They will use their 90 days to hope, and hope, my old friend, is the softest thing in the universe. It breaks first, and it breaks worst, and it takes the whole soul with it when it goes." Thren said nothing. He had broken enough worlds to know that his emperor was usually right, and usually right was the most dangerous kind of right there was, because it made a being stop counting the times he was not. "When do we make transit?" Ossruth asked. 30 days, Radiance. The rites of departure, the blessing of the yards, the provisioning." "Then in 30 days," Ossruth said, "I will hear the word no become a wetter sound. Give the order. We go to break the children." And in the mountain, 90 days from ruin and shrinking, Corin Vale had 30 of those days taken from her by the same order, and did not yet know it, and worked through the night as though every hour were the last one, because some part of her, the part that lived below thought, had always known that it might be. The 30 days that Corin thought were 90 became, in the ruthless arithmetic of a fleet that had departed early, exactly 63 when the Concord's long-range listening posts caught the transit signature of the 9th Conquest Fleet leaving VHASC Prime. The number rippled through Cell 7 like a cold current. 63 days. Then, as the astrogators refined the vector, 58. The Emperor had been generous with himself and stingy with them, and now even that stinginess had been clawed back. Corin did not let herself feel it. She had learned in the 2 fast weeks a trick that Nadine would have recognized. She took the fear and she put it in the equation as a variable, and then she solved for it. Panic was just an input she had not yet found the right operation for. 58 days, she told her interdiction team, 20-odd young pilots and engineers who had somehow, over the past weeks, come to look at her the way you look at someone who knows where the floor is. Which means our plan doesn't get to be finished. It gets to be real. Everything we haven't built by day 58 we don't have. So we stop designing and we start deciding. What do we keep? What do we cut? Go. The plan they had built in the Cathedral of Rock and Lamplight was not a battle plan. It was, as Aeul had said, a way of being impossible. It had 100 moving parts, and Corin could hold all of them in her head at once, which was the thing that frightened the older officers most about her, the way she could see the whole machine turning. But at the center of it were 3 ideas, and she made her team recite them until they were reflex, because in the chaos to come, there would be no time to reason and only reflex would survive. The first idea was the mines, not the crude proximity ordnance the ascendancy expected and could sweep in an afternoon, but something the human worlds had in grotesque abundance, and the VHASC had never had to think about. Junk. 60 years of colonial industry had filled the Kesh Corridor with the discarded skeletons of dead freighters, spent reactor cores, mining slag, decommissioned station modules, the vast orbital debris of a working system. The conquered could not build a wall of warships. But it could, with the labor of 10,000 welders and the direction of Corin's engineers, turn the corridor's own garbage into a labyrinth, a three-dimensional maze of tumbling hulks, some inert, some packed with shaped charges, some carrying nothing but a transponder that lied about being packed with shaped charges. A fleet built to arrive in a tight arrowhead and process a surrender would have to slow, spread, and pick its way through, and every hour it spent picking was an hour it bled certainty. The second idea was the pilots. The ascendancy fought in formations, disciplined and beautiful and utterly predictable, because their doctrine had never been seriously challenged and so had never been forced to evolve. Human pilots did not fight in formations. Human pilots, Corin's pilots, flew the way she had learned to fly a too-heavy haul on a bad approach, on instinct, on the edge of the machine's tolerance, in ways no doctrine could predict because they were not the product of doctrine but of 1,000 hours of getting it wrong and living. She organized them into what she called packs, small, fast, deniable, each one built around a single principle. Never fight the guns, always fight the weak. Strike the tankers, strike the tenders, strike the transports. Strike the soft train of a fleet built to accept surrender, and then vanish into the labyrinth before the guns could answer, and do it again the next hour, and the next, until the greatest fleet in the arm found itself starving in the middle of its own conquest. The third idea was the one Corin trusted least and needed most, and it was not hers. It was Aeol's, and it was cruel, and it was the reason a demonstration might become a wound that would not close. "We let them watch," Aeol said, the night they finalized it. "Every ship in the Ascendancy fleet carries a war recorder, and every recorder feeds the propaganda organs that maintain the story of inevitability across 1,100 worlds. Their own machine broadcasts their victories to keep the subject worlds afraid. So we don't try to jam it. We feed it. We make sure that what the Ascendancy's own cameras record and transmit to their own people on their own channels is not a surrender. It is a fleet that arrived to process children and stayed to bleed. We make the story tell itself in their own voice to the exact audience most dangerous to them. 1,100 worlds that have been told resistance is pointless will watch, on the Ascendancy's own broadcast, a mining colony make it expensive." She had looked in that moment very old and very frightened and very sure. "That is the whole war, Corin, not the mines, not the pilots. Those are just how we get the pictures. The pictures are the war." Corin had understood then why they had filled a war room with the young. It was not because the young were expendable. It was because the war they were fighting was, at its root, a war of belief, and the young had not yet learned to believe in inevitability. They had grown up losing at games for fun and getting up again, and that reflex, that specific ineducable human refusal, was the actual weapon. Everything else was delivery mechanism. 58 days became 40. 40 became 25. The labyrinth grew in the corridor. Thousands of tumbling hulks nudged into a slow, lethal ballet by tugs and welders working in shifts around the clock. The packs flew until the pilots could navigate the maze blind. The soft-eyed teenagers who had argued in a single continuous sound, built the light transponders and the recorder feeds, and the 1,000 small deceptions that would make a fleet distrust its own sensors. And Corin Vale, 19 years old, stopped sleeping in any real sense and began to look, Nadine thought when he visited on day 20, less like a cadet and more like the thing Kesh needed her to be. Not a hero, because heroes were a story too and stories broke. Something harder than a hero. A person who had simply decided, in the place below thought, that she would not be told no, and who had found 200 others who had decided the same, and had pointed all that refusal at a single, unbearable point in the dark. "You should sleep," Nadine told her. "I'll sleep on day 59, she said, when there's nothing left to build, and he did not have the heart to tell her that on day 59 there might not be a Corin Vale to do the sleeping. He suspected she already knew. He suspected it was the source of the terrible calm that had settled over her, the calm of a person who has stopped bargaining with the odds and started simply working inside them. The weight of 10,000 years crossed into the Kesh Corridor on what the humans called Day 59, and the Vhasgarn called the first day of the processing. And Emperor Ossruth Vaan came to the observation spire to watch a colony surrender. What he saw first was the debris. "Explain that," he said to Fleetmaster Thren, gesturing at the tactical display, where the clean approach vectors his astrogators had plotted were fouled with a vast, slow-turning field of wreckage that stretched across the entire coreward face of the system. "Have they had a disaster? Is that a shipyard accident?" Thren studied the display for a long moment, and Ossruth watched something happen to the old warrior's carriage that he had never seen in 200 years. Thren went still, the particular stillness of a predator that has just understood that the thing in front of it is not, after all, prey. "No, Radiance," Thren said quietly. "It is not an accident, it is a wall. They have made a wall out of their own garbage and seeded it, and they have placed it exactly across our approach, so that we must either slow and pick through it, exposing our formation and our timetable, or drive through it and lose ships to whatever they have hidden inside." He turned. "They knew our approach vectors. They knew we would come in tight and fast to process a surrender, and they built this to make certain that we could not. This is not the work of frightened children, Radiance. This is the work of someone who understood exactly how we fight, and decided to make it impossible." Ossruth felt, for the first time in a very long time, a small cold thing move in his thorax. He did not recognize it because he had not felt it in so long. It was the beginning of doubt. He crushed it. "Then we drive through," he said. "Let them lose their garbage wall to our guns. We have 400 capital ships in 11 days. I will not have it said that the 9th Conquest Fleet was slowed by a mining colony's trash." "As you command," Thren said, and under his breath, so quietly that even the Emperor's fine hearing did not catch it, the old warrior said a thing he had not said in 200 years of breaking worlds. "But it will be said, Radiance. I fear it will be said for a very long time." The fleet drove into the labyrinth. For the first hour, Ossruth's contempt seemed vindicated. The great warships plowed into the debris field, and the debris was, as he had assumed, mostly garbage, and the guns of the fleet reduced whole tumbling hulks to expanding clouds of slag with contemptuous ease. The formation slowed but held. The processing had begun. Then the labyrinth began to fight back, and it did not fight the warships. The first loss was a fuel tanker, the Patient Abundance, drifting near the rear of the formation where the soft train followed the warships in exactly the tight, lean, unthreatened posture that 1100 victories had taught the ascendancy was safe. It simply ceased to exist between one moment and the next, in a flash that the war recorders dutifully captured, and per their programming, transmitted. One instant it was there, laden with the fuel that 400 capital ships would need to maneuver and fight, and eventually to leave. The next it was a cooling ring of debris, and a single small human craft was already gone, vanished back into the tumbling maze before the nearest warship's guns could even acquire a target. "A raider," Thren said, "one raider. It came through the labyrinth which our sensors cannot map because it is full of false signals and true ones and lies that look like both. It struck the tanker because the tanker cannot fight and it left, and Radiance." The old warrior's voice was very level. "It transmitted. It made certain we recorded it. They want us to see this. They want everyone to see this." Ossruth looked at the cooling ring where the Patient Abundance had been. He looked at the vast, slow labyrinth of garbage that his fleet was even now committed to plowing through. He performed, for the first time, the arithmetic he had refused to perform since the humans had sent him a single word. He counted his tankers and his tenders and his provisions, and he set them against a labyrinth that could hide 1,000 raiders, and against an enemy that had, apparently, decided not to defend anything, but only to destroy the soft, slow things that a fleet needs to live. He had provisioned for 30 days. His officers had complained even at that. And a young voice he had never heard, a voice that lived in a mountain 900 light-years from the world where he had laughed at her, had built a machine designed to make 30 days last a year. "Radiance," Thren said, "what are your orders?" Ossruth Vaan, ninth of his line, master of 1,100 subject worlds, did not answer for a very long time, and the small cold thing in his thorax, the doubt he had crushed an hour ago, uncrushed itself and began, very quietly, to grow. There was a night, on day 31 of the shrinking count, that Corin Vale nearly gave the whole thing away, and it was not the enemy who almost undid her but her own certainty, which was a lesson the Emperor never learned, and she learned early enough to survive it. The plan had a flaw. She had found it herself at 3 in the morning, staring at the labyrinth model with eyes that had not properly closed in 4 days, and the flaw was this. The packs were flying the maze on memorized routes, blind drills burned into reflex, and reflex was fast, and fast was everything against a fleet that would try to trap them. But memorized routes were also predictable, and a fleet master with 200 years of hunting behind him would, given a week, begin to notice that the human raiders always struck the tenders from the same 7 approach corridors, because those were the corridors the pilots had learned. Corin had built her own pilots a habit, and habits could be read, and a fleet that read the habit could seed those 7 corridors with minds of its own and turn the killing box inside out. She had seen it, and her first instinct, the instinct of a 19-year-old who could hold the whole machine in her head, was to fix it herself, to sit down and redesign the approach corridors, all 7, in the 6 hours before the next flight, and hand her pilots a new set of routes to memorize on no sleep, because she was the one who saw the flaw and therefore she was the one who had to close it. She was halfway into the redesign when Adiz found her. Adiz was a pack leader, 22, the oldest of Corin's pilots and the steadiest, a former ore hauler who had flown the Kesh approaches for 6 years before the war and who had, Corin had noticed, a way of going quiet and still before she said the thing that mattered. She went quiet and still now, standing over the half-built redesign, and she read it, and then she said, "You're going to get us killed." "I'm going to keep you alive," Corin said, not looking up. "The corridors are predictable. Thren will read them." "I'm fixing it." "You're changing 7 memorized routes into 7 new memorized routes, on no sleep, 6 hours before a flight, and you're going to hand them to pilots who have drilled the old ones into reflex for a month, and you're going to ask us to fly a maze full of a fleet's guns on routes we learned this afternoon." Adiz crouched down so she was level with Corin's exhausted face. "You see the whole machine. That's your gift, and it's going to kill us because you think that because you can see it, you have to be the one who turns every gear. You don't. The flaw is real. The fix isn't Corin builds new routes. The fix is the pilots stop flying routes." Corin stopped. "We're not machines," Adiz said quietly. "That's the whole point of us, isn't it? That's the thing you keep telling the Directorate. The Vhasgarn fly doctrine, we fly instinct, they can't predict us. So stop making us predictable, stop giving us routes. Give us a rule and let each of us solve the maze fresh every flight the way we solve a bad approach on the edge of the machine by feel. Thren can read 7 corridors. He can't read 40 pilots each improvising a different path to the same tender. You built a wall out of garbage. Build a doctrine out of no doctrine. And then go to sleep, because you've been solving our problems for us for a week, and the whole reason this works is that we don't need you to." Corin Vale looked at the half-built redesign, the 6 hours of work she had been about to pour into being indispensable, and she understood that she had been, for a week, quietly making the same mistake the Emperor made, only in miniature and in the opposite direction. He had trusted his fleet too little to imagine it could fail, and she had trusted her pilots too little to imagine they could win without her turning every gear. Both errors came from the same root, which was the belief that one mind could hold a war. "Give them a rule," she said slowly. "Give us a rule," Adiz agreed. "One sentence. The kind you make us recite in the dark." Corin deleted the redesign. She sat for a moment in the humming quiet of the gallery, and then she wrote a single line, and she gave it to the Pax the next morning, and it was the line that broke Thren's every attempt to trap them for the rest of the campaign, because it could not be read, because it was not a route but a refusal to have one. "Never fly the same maze twice. If you can predict yourself, so can he." Then she went asleep, for the first time in 4 days, and Adiz stood watch over her for 6 hours so that no one would wake her with a problem the pilots could solve themselves. And when Corin woke, the Pax had already flown and killed 3 tenders and lost no one, on 40 different improvised paths that no fleet master in the galaxy could have seeded in advance. And Corin understood that she had learned, at 31 days from ruin, the lesson that would let the whole thing hold. That the strength of the human machine was that it was not a machine, that it was 200 stubborn minds each refusing to be told no in their own way, and that her job was not to be all of them, but to point all of them at the same unbearable place in the dark. Fleet Master Thren spent the 3rd week of the processing trying to understand an enemy that would not hold still long enough to be understood, and it was the most frightening intellectual experience of his 200-year life. He was not a fool. He had broken worlds whose defenders were clever, whose defenders were desperate, whose defenders had studied ascendancy doctrine for a generation in the hope of finding a seam in it. He knew how to fight a clever enemy. You found the pattern because all doctrine was pattern, and you turned the pattern against itself. Every defense he had ever broken had been, at its root, a system, and systems could be reverse-engineered by a patient enough mind. The humans had no system, and it was destroying him. He would identify, after painstaking analysis, the corridors through which the raiders struck his tenders, and he would seed those corridors. And the next day the raiders would strike through entirely different corridors, and the day after that through corridors that made no tactical sense at all except that they worked. And slowly Thren came to the horrifying understanding that he was not fighting a doctrine. He was fighting 40 separate minds, each of them improvising freshly every time, each of them making decisions that no analysis could predict because they were not the output of any predictable process, but of that specific human thing, that reflex bred across 3,000 years, of solving a fresh problem freshly, on instinct, on the edge, by feel. "They do not repeat themselves," he told his staff, and his staff, younger V. Hasgarn who had never lost, looked at him as though he had said something that could not be true, because in their entire lives they had never fought an enemy who did not, sooner or later, repeat itself. "Do you understand what I am telling you? An enemy that does not repeat itself cannot be reverse-engineered. There is no pattern to find because they are actively refusing to have one. Every doctrine in the archive, every technique we have used to break every world we have ever broken, assumes an enemy who is a system. These are not a system. These are 40 children each doing the single most inconvenient thing they can think of, and coordinating only in that they have all agreed to be inconvenient." He had by the end of the 3rd week stopped trying to trap them, because every trap he built was a pattern, and a pattern was a thing the humans read faster than he could build it. He had begun, instead, simply to defend, to pull his tenders in tight and ring them with warships, and accept that he could not hunt the raiders, only survive them, and the survival was expensive, and the expense was broadcast, and the broadcast was the war. And on the 18th day, when his emperor spoke of a 3rd option and Thren heard fear in that ancient voice, the old warrior had already made a private peace with the truth that the young V. Hasgarn on his staff could not yet face. That the ascendancy had, in the Kesh Corridor, encountered the one thing an empire of certainty had no defense against, which was a species that had made a discipline out of unpredictability, a doctrine out of the refusal to have one, and a weapon out of the simple, ineducable, 3,000-year-old human habit of getting up when it lost and trying something new. He did not hate them for it. He was too old and had broken too many worlds to hate an enemy who had finally, at the very end of his life, shown him something he had never seen. If anything, standing in the spire beside an emperor whose certainty was crumbling in real time, watching a labyrinth of garbage eat the greatest fleet the arm had ever produced, Fleet Master Thren felt something he had not felt since he was young, something he had almost forgotten a warrior could feel toward an enemy. He felt awe. What the broadcast did to the subject worlds in those 18 days was a thing no one in Cell 7 could see, and everyone in Cell 7 had gambled on. The Ascendancy's propaganda web reached 1,100 worlds, and it had reached them for 10,000 years with a single unbroken message. The fleet comes, the world bends, the fleet moves on. Generation after generation of subject peoples had grown up watching the conquests as a kind of weather, an inevitability filmed and transmitted precisely so that no one would imagine it could be otherwise. A Silicon elder, 300 years old, who had watched her own hives broken when she was a child, later described what it had been like to sit in her habitat on a tribute world and watch, on the Ascendancy's own channel, the images come in from Kesh. She had expected, she said, another conquest. She had prepared herself, the way her people prepared themselves, to watch a young species learn the lesson her own people had learned in fire, and instead she had watched a fleet arrive to process a surrender that never came. She had watched the greatest warships in the arm swat at gnats and miss. She had watched, on the oppressor's own broadcast, a mining colony's garbage eat an empire's certainty one tanker at a time. And she had felt, she said, a thing she had not felt in 300 years, a thing she had believed her people had lost the capacity to feel. She had felt the weather change. There is a moment in the life of any tyranny of fear when the fear stops being self-sustaining. It is not the moment of the first defeat. It is the moment when the first defeat is witnessed by the right audience in a way that cannot be reframed. Corin Vale had not invented that principle. Sabine Aeul had known it for a career, and older strategists had known it for longer, and it was, in truth, one of the oldest ideas in the human archive, the idea that a chain is broken not in the link but in the mind that believes the chain cannot be broken. What Corin had done, what the machine of Cell 7 had done, was engineer the conditions for that moment with a precision no one had ever managed before. They had made certain that the first witnessed, unreframable defeat of the Ascendancy would be broadcast by the Ascendancy itself, to the Ascendancy's own subjects, in the same hour, on every channel, with no counter-narrative fast enough to catch it. They had, in the coldest and most literal sense, turned the enemy's greatest strength, its total control of the story, into the delivery mechanism for the story's destruction. Corin thought about the subject worlds often, in the deep gallery, though she would never meet most of them and could only imagine them. She thought about the Silicon elder she did not know existed, and the tribute poets of Ottava, and the 40 worlds that would one day quote her declaration back at the collectors, and she understood that she was not, in the end, fighting for Kesh alone, or even mostly. She was fighting for the mind that believed the chain could not be broken, on 1,100 worlds she would never see, and the strange, terrible privilege of her situation was that she got to break it not with an army she did not have, but with a picture the enemy could not stop transmitting. "Do you ever think about after?" Adiz asked her on one of the last nights, the two of them sitting in the gallery while the packs rested and the labyrinth turned in the dark overhead. "If it works, if we're still here, what you'll do?" Corin thought about it. She thought about her mother's mag couplings and the ore haulers older than the colony, and the humming lecture hall where a tired man had told her there was no other lesson, and she had told him there was. "I think I'll go home," she said, "and fix machines, And when they ask me to be a hero, I'll say no because heroes are a story and I've learned how dangerous stories are." She almost smiled. "And I think I'll teach. There'll be another sky someday. There always is. And when it comes, I want there to be a room full of kids who never learned they couldn't win, so they can point all of that refusal at whatever's up there, the way we pointed ours at this." Adiz was quiet for a while, then she said, "He called us children." "He was right," Corin said. "That's the part he never understood. We are children. That's not the weakness he thought it was. A child hasn't learned yet what's impossible. That's the whole thing. That's the only weapon we ever had. And it's the one weapon his 10,000 years never taught him to see. Because you can't conquer it. You can only outlive it. And no empire outlives a species that keeps having children who never learn to stay down." Overhead in the dark, the labyrinth of a colony's garbage turned slowly against the stars, and somewhere out in it a pack was flying a maze it had never flown before, on 40 improvised paths no fleet master could read, killing the soft, slow things that kept an empire alive, and transmitting every kill to 1,100 worlds that were, one mind at a time, beginning to feel the weather change. The first week of the processing did not go the way any processing had ever gone. Emperor Ossruth had ordered the fleet to drive through the labyrinth, and it drove and it paid. Not in warships at first. The warships were nearly untouchable, and the humans did not touch them. That was the thing that gnawed at the Hasgarn commanders as the days wore on, the thing they could not reconcile with any doctrine they knew. The enemy would not fight them. Present a human raider with a capital ship and a fuel tender in the same engagement, and every time, without exception, it ignored the capital ship and killed the tender and fled. It was as though the greatest weapons in the fleet were beneath the enemy's notice, and only the soft, slow things that kept the fleet alive were worth the killing. By the fourth day, the 9th Conquest Fleet had lost 11 fuel tankers, 7 ammunition tenders, and 19 supply transports, and had destroyed and returned several hundred pieces of tumbling garbage and precisely 2 human raiders, both of which had been caught by luck rather than skill and both of whose deaths had been broadcast, by the Ascendancy's own recorders, to 1,100 worlds, and had looked on the broadcast, not like victories but like a giant swatting at gnats and missing. Corin Vale watched those 2 deaths from the deep gallery of Cell 7, and she made herself watch, and she made herself learn their names. Davy Sarkar, 20. Tomas Ellison, 18. She had flown with both of them. She had taught Tomas the blind navigation drill herself, in the maze, on day 30. She put their deaths in the equation, as variables, because that was the only way she knew to keep functioning. And then she went and found their packmates, and she did not offer them comfort, because comfort was a lie and they would know it. And instead she offered them the truth, which was that Davy and Tomas had each killed a tanker before they died, and that a tanker was worth more to the war than 100 of the enemy's guns. "They didn't die for Kesh," she told the pack, and her voice did not shake because she had put the shaking in the equation. "They died to make the week into a year, and it's working. Look," she pulled up the broadcast, the Ascendancy's own broadcast, the one meant to keep 1,100 worlds afraid, and she showed them the giant swatting at gnats and missing, and she watched their grief turn slowly into something harder and more useful. "Their own cameras are telling our story. Every tender we kill they broadcast because they can't help it, because their whole empire is built to broadcast, and they never once imagined they'd be broadcasting this. Fly the drill. Kill the soft things. Come home, and if you don't come home, you'll have done more than any speech. You'll have made resistance look expensive on the enemy's own channel, and there is no more dangerous thing in the galaxy than that." They flew the drill, they killed the soft things. Most of them came home, some did not. Corin learned all their names. By the second week, the arithmetic had begun to bend. Ossruth had committed his fleet to a campaign. His fleet was not built to fight. He could not withdraw, not without withdrawing on the Ascendancy's own broadcast, which would be an admission of defeat, transmitted directly to the audience most primed to act on it. He could not process a surrender, because there was no one surrendering. The human population of Kesh had, on Aayul's cold instruction, gone deep and gone quiet, and refused to give the fleet the one thing its entire doctrine was optimized to accept. And he could not sustain the fleet, because a fleet built to arrive fast and process fast did not carry the fuel or the food or the munitions for a siege. And the labyrinth was eating his supply train, one soft, slow ship at a time. Fleet Master Thren came to him on the 15th day with the numbers, and Ossruth made himself read them, because he had learned, too late, that a being who stops counting the times he is wrong has stopped being an emperor and started being a fool. At the current rate of attrition to our logistics train, Thren said, we can sustain offensive operations for another 40 days. After that, we begin to consume our reserves. After 60, we begin to ration fuel, which means we can no longer maneuver the fleet at will, which means the labyrinth stops being an inconvenience and becomes a trap, because a fleet that cannot maneuver cannot pick its way through a maze that is trying to kill it. The old warrior set down the data slate. Radiance, I have broken worlds for you for 200 years. I have never once counseled retreat. I counsel it now, not because we cannot take Kesh. We can take Kesh. We can grind through the labyrinth and starve the colony and stand on its rock in 90 days. But it will cost us a third of the fleet, and it will cost us every tanker and tender we have, and it will cost us, on our own broadcast, to our own worlds, the one thing that has kept 1,100 of them obedient. It will cost us the story, Radiance, and a fleet is a thing we can rebuild. The story, once it breaks, does not come back. Ossruth was silent for a long time. He was thinking, though Thren did not know it, of the images he had watched in his grown throne room a lifetime ago, the images of the soft endoskeletal bipeds who played games with balls and words and numbers, who lost and got up and tried again at things that did not matter. He had called them children. He had been right that they were young. He had been catastrophically, ruinously wrong about what young meant. He had thought it meant soft. He understood now, with the cold thing in his thorax grown to permanent resident, that it meant they had never been taught the lesson his own 1,100 worlds had learned so well. That resistance was pointless, that the sky was inevitable, that the only sane response to overwhelming force was to bend the knee in stages. The humans had never learned it because no one had ever successfully taught it to them, and now, in a mining corridor at the edge of nowhere, they were teaching it in reverse to him. If we retreat, Ossruth said slowly, the story breaks. Yes, Radiance. And if we stay and win, the story breaks worse, because our own cameras will have shown 1,100 worlds what victory over humans costs, and they will do the arithmetic themselves, and some of them will decide that it is arithmetic they can afford to force upon us too. Thren said nothing. He did not need to. The Emperor had, at last and too late, understood the trap in its full and beautiful cruelty. There was no move that did not break the story. The humans had not built a defense. They had built a machine with no good outputs, and then they had made certain the Ascendancy's own broadcast organs would show every output to the exact audience most dangerous to the throne. Corin Vale had done, on a galactic scale, precisely what she had told Professor Nadine she would do in a humming lecture hall. She had changed what was in the equation, and the answer had changed. And the answer was that an empire ruled by fear had walked, laughing, into a war that fear could not win. There is a third option, Ossruth said at last, and Thren went still again, because he heard something in the Emperor's voice that he had never heard in 200 years. He heard fear. We do not retreat and we do not grind, Ossruth said. We negotiate openly, on the broadcast. We offer the humans terms, and we let our own cameras record us offering them, and we frame it as the mercy of a great power to a brave foe. He was speaking faster now, the mind that had ruled 1,100 worlds racing to build a story that could survive. A truce, a withdrawal from Kesh, in exchange for a treaty of non-aggression, framed as magnanimity. The subject worlds see not a defeat but a negotiation between equals, and equals do not frighten. We salvage the story by changing what the story is about. We make it a tale of the ascendancy's wisdom rather than its weakness. Thren considered it for a long moment. It was, he had to admit, the cleverest thing the Emperor had said in the entire campaign. It might even work. It might salvage the fleet and salvage the story, and turn a catastrophe into a merely expensive lesson. There was only one flaw in it, and the flaw was this. It required the humans to accept the terms. It required the young species that had never learned to bend the knee, that had built a machine with no good outputs specifically to make certain the ascendancy could not win, to agree to a truce that let the Emperor call it mercy. And Thren, who had watched them refuse to defend anything, who had watched them ignore his warships to kill his tankers, who had watched a 19-year-old he would never meet turn a mining colony's garbage into the graveyard of an empire's certainty, did not think the humans were in the mood to let anyone call it mercy. "I will draft the offer, Radiance," Thren said, "but I would prepare yourself. These are not a people who, having found the thing that beats us, will be quick to hand it back." The offer reached Cell 7 on the 18th day of the processing, transmitted openly, exactly as Ossruth had planned, on the Ascendancy's own broadcast channels, so that 1100 worlds could watch the great power extend its mercy to a brave foe. Aeol brought it to Corin herself, in the deep gallery, and the 200 young people of Cell 7 gathered around, and they watched the Emperor of the Vhasgarn Ascendancy, master of 1100 worlds, offer to withdraw from Kesh in exchange for a treaty of non-aggression, framed as the wisdom of the strong toward the young. When it ended, the gallery was silent. "He's giving us Kesh," said one of the pilots, a young man named Adi's brother whose name Corin knew, of course, because she knew all their names. His voice was disbelieving. "He's leaving. We won." "No," Corin said. She said it quietly, but the gallery heard it, because they had learned over 63 days to hear it when Corin Vale said a small hard word into a room that wanted to believe something easier. She stood, and she looked at the frozen image of the Emperor extending his mercy, and she felt the thing turn over in her chest that had been turning over since the first ultimatum, the refusal that lived below thought. "He's not giving us Kesh," she said. "He's giving us a story. He wants to withdraw and call it mercy. He wants the 1100 worlds to watch him leave and see wisdom instead of weakness. He wants a treaty that lets him say, on his own broadcast to his own frightened worlds, that the Ascendancy chose to spare us. And the second we accept that, we hand him back the exact thing we spent 63 days taking away. We hand him back the story. We hand him back inevitability." She turned to Aeol. "We didn't fight this war for Kesh, Coordinator. You told me that on the first day. The pictures are the war, and he just offered us a picture of his own mercy in exchange for the pictures of his weakness. That's not a truce. That's a trade, and it's a terrible one." Aeol looked at her for a long moment. The flat, careful eyes of someone who had spent a career being right about terrible things. "The Directorate," she said slowly, "is inclined to accept. It saves Kesh. 90 million people. It ends the fighting before the fleet decides to grind after all. Every officer above me sees a young species being offered its survival by an empire that could crush it, and they see wisdom in taking the offer. And they are not wrong, Corin. If we refuse, the Emperor may choose to grind and Kesh may burn, and 90 million people may die for a story." She paused. "So tell me why we should refuse. Not tell me you feel it. Tell me why. In the equation." And Corin Vale, 19 years old, standing in a cathedral of rock and lamplight at the edge of a war she had reframed into existence, told her why. "Because the offer proves we've already won the thing that matters," Corin said, "and if we take it, we lose it back. Look at the arithmetic, Coordinator. 18 days ago the Emperor of 1100 worlds laughed at a single word from us. Today, on his own broadcast, he is asking us for terms. He has not been beaten in the field. His fleet is intact. His guns are untouched. And he is asking us for terms anyway, because he has understood, 18 days in, that there is no way for him to win that does not cost him the story. That is the whole war, and we have already won it. And the proof that we have won it is that he is offering us mercy he does not have the strength to withhold cheaply. She turned to face the gallery, 200 young faces in the lamplight, and she raised her voice so that all of them would hear it, because this was the moment she understood that the whole thing had been building toward, and it was not a moment of guns. If we accept the truce, here is what the 1100 worlds see. They see the ascendancy choose to withdraw. They see it framed as wisdom. They see a young species survive because a great power was merciful. And the fear comes back, Coordinator. The fear comes back the instant they believe that mercy was the Emperor's to give, because a power that can grant mercy is a power that can withhold it, and that is the whole engine of their obedience. We hand him back inevitability and we call it peace. And if we refuse, Ael's voice was very quiet. If we refuse, Corin said, we don't refuse to survive. We refuse to let him call it mercy. We make our own broadcast. We answer his offer on every channel we can reach, the same channels his own fleet has been feeding for 18 days, and we do not say no. We say more than no. She looked at the frozen image of the Emperor extending his hand. We declare it, openly, to all 1100 worlds at once, not a war of conquest. Not a war of vengeance. A total war, disciplined and absolute, waged not against the Vhasgarn people, not against a single subject world, not against one child or farmer or welder anywhere under that flag, but against one thing and one thing only, the machine of fear itself. The war fleets, the conquest yards, the staging grounds, the apparatus that arrives in the sky of a peaceful world and tells it to bend the knee. We declare that from this day the Terran conquered will treat every such fleet, everywhere, the way we treated the one that came for Kesh. Not with hatred, with arithmetic. We will make the taking of any world so ruinous that the taking stops. And we will do it in the open, so that 1100 worlds do not have to wonder whether it is possible. They will have watched us do it. The gallery was utterly silent. That is not the peace the Directorate wants, Ael said. No, Corin agreed. It's the peace they need and won't ask for. The truce saves 90 million people and loses 1100 worlds to another 10,000 years of the knee. The declaration risks Kesh to free all of them, and I know which one is harder to say out loud. I know it's my station and my people and my mother's mag couplings on the rock the fleet is sitting over. I have more to lose from the declaration than anyone in this room, and I'm telling you it's the one that ends the story instead of renewing it. Her voice, at last, shook, and she let it, and it was somehow stronger for the shaking. He called us children who had never lost. He was right that we'd never lost. He was wrong about what that made us. It didn't make us soft. It made us the only people in the galaxy who never learned that this was inevitable. So let's teach the galaxy what we know, let's declare it, and let's mean it. Sabine Aeul, veteran of being right about terrible things, looked at the 19-year-old from the mining station for a long, long moment. Then she reached into her coat and took out a Directorate authorization key, the kind carried only by those empowered to speak for the conquered in the field when the conquered itself was too slow or too frightened to speak, and she turned it over in her fingers. I was given this, she said, to accept the truce. My orders are to accept the truce. She looked at the key. I have spent a career being right about terrible things, Corin, and the most terrible thing I have ever been right about is that the young see the shape of a war more clearly than the old, because the old have already made their peace with losing, and the young have not made peace with anything. She closed her fist around the key. Draft the declaration. I'll transmit it under my authority, and I'll answer for it, and if the conquered wants to hang me for it afterward, they'll have to do it on the same broadcast the whole galaxy is about to be watching. Corin Vale wrote the declaration of Earth's total war in 90 minutes, in the deep gallery, with 200 young people reading over her shoulder and correcting nothing, because there was nothing to correct. And when it was done, Sabine Aayul transmitted it on every channel the Conquered could reach, into the same broadcast web the Ascendancy's own fleet had been feeding for 18 days, so that it arrived not as an isolated human boast, but as the answer, the direct and undeniable answer, to an emperor's offer of mercy, watched in the same hour by the same 1100 worlds. Emperor Ossruth Vaan received the human answer in the observation spire of the weight of 10,000 years, and he watched it in full, because he had learned, too late, to make himself look at the things that frightened him. He had expected acceptance. He had built, with real cleverness, an escape that let him withdraw and call it wisdom, and he had believed, right up until the moment the human broadcast began, that the young species would take the survival he offered, because survival was the softest and strongest wanting there was. Instead, a young human voice he had never heard, speaking for a colony he had marked for erasure, refused his mercy in front of the entire spiral arm and told him why, and the why was worse than any weapon in the human arsenal. It was not hatred. He could have survived hatred. Hatred was a thing his own propaganda could reframe as the snarling of a cornered beast. It was not even defiance, not really. It was a declaration, cold and disciplined and precise, that the Terran Conquered would from this day treat every fear machine like the one that had come for Kesh, everywhere in the open, against the apparatus and never against the innocent, until the apparatus was not worth the building. It was an offer, made to 1100 watching worlds, of the one thing the Ascendancy had spent 10,000 years making sure no world could believe in, an alternative to the knee. Thren, Ossruth said, and his voice for the first time in 200 years was the voice of a being who understood that he had been the author of his own ruin. When I laughed at them, in the throne room, you did not laugh. No, Radiance. You saw it. You saw that a species that gets up when it loses is a species that has never been taught the only lesson that keeps an empire standing. I feared it, Radiance, Thren said quietly. I did not see it whole. No one saw it whole until a child in a mountain made it whole and pointed it at us. She did not build a wall to stop us. She built a mirror. She made our own fleet, our own cameras, our own broadcast, show the galaxy that we could be made to bleed. And now she has offered the galaxy the arithmetic to do the bleeding themselves. The old warrior looked out at the labyrinth of tumbling garbage that had eaten 18 days and a third of his supply train, and the whole of his emperor's certainty. We came to break the children, Radiance. And the children have declared on our own channels that the breaking is over, not just here, everywhere. That is the war they have actually won, not Kesh. The idea that any Kesh anywhere has to be lost. Ossruth Vaan sat in the spire of his flagship, master of 1100 worlds that were, in that hour, watching him on his own broadcast and doing arithmetic they had never before dared to do, and he understood at last and completely the size of the mistake he had made when he had called a young species children and dismissed them with a wave of a heavy hand. He gave the order to withdraw the 9th Conquest Fleet from the Kesh Corridor. He did not frame it as mercy. There was no one left to believe him. He framed it as nothing at all, because the fleet master was right, and there were no words that could reframe a mirror. The great warships turned, one by one, and picked their careful way back out through the labyrinth of a mining colony's garbage, and every subject world in the Ascendancy watched them go, on the Emperor's own channels, and understood that they were watching not a withdrawal but the first hour of the end of an age. By the following year, 4 subject worlds had refused the tithe and cited Kesh, and quoted the human declaration back at the collectors sent to bring them to heel. By the year after that, it was 40. The Ascendancy did not fall in a battle. It fell the way certainty always falls, one refusal at a time, each one a little less unthinkable than the last, until the machine of fear was no longer worth the cost of the building, exactly as a 19-year-old had promised on a broadcast the whole arm had watched. Emperor Ossruth Vaan lived long enough to see the beginning of it, and died, his court records noted with careful neutrality, a diminished figure, much given in his final years to reviewing old images of soft endoskeletal bipeds who played games with balls and words and numbers, who lost, and got up, and tried again. The Kesh Corridor was never taken. Corin Vale went home to Kesh Station 3 when it was over, and helped her mother repair the mag couplings on ore haulers older than the colony, and did not tell the Concord's historians most of what they wanted to know, because she did not think of herself as a story, and she had learned at 19 how dangerous stories were. She was made, over her considerable objections, an instructor at the Braddock Massif, where Ilian Nadine was retiring, and where the first lesson she taught the incoming cadets was not how to run and was not how to fight the guns. It was a single sentence, chalked on the board of a humming lecture hall, that they were made to recite until it became reflex, the way she had once made her pilots recite in the dark. "I don't know yet, and it's impossible" are different sentences. She was, by the reckoning of the empire that had dismissed her, still very young. She would remain so for a good while yet, and that, she had come to understand, standing in front of a room of people even younger than herself, was the whole of it, the thing the Emperor never grasped until it had unmade him, that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy was not the oldest fleet or the largest gun, but a young species that had never been taught it could lose, refusing in the place below thought to be told no.